know, the National Assembly of Kosovo recently adopted an amendment to their constitution, giving effect to this convention on preventing and combating violence against women. I would like to introduce the panel, the speakers. First, my name is Johanna Valenius, and I'm the head of the ULEX monitoring pillar. And then we have here Judge Shpresa Emra. I hope that I pronounced the names correctly. She has since 2010 worked as a judge in Prizren, first in the municipality court, then later in the basic court. And currently she's also a coordinating judge in Prizren. Then we have here prosecutor Iliriana Cholakutafa. She has worked with the Ombudsperson institution, after which she moved over to ULEX to work as a legal advisor. And currently she is a state prosecutor in the basic prosecution office in Pristina. And then finally, we have here Giara Tagliani. She has worked in ULEX since 2011, first as a legal officer in Mitrovica, legal officer for the judges in Mitrovica. And then she moved over to the monitoring pillar as a thematic lead monitor on gender-based violence. And now she works as the gender advisor to the mission. There are, as in the previous talks, there are 3 questions. And I will ask one question and then every speaker has a chance to answer. And then I go to the next question. And after we have had these questions, then I open the floor for any questions if there are any. I think they have to be written on the chat. That was what Alina said. Okay, everybody is ready to start? So regarding the legislation of violence against women and the domestic violence, Kosovo benefits from a very advanced legislative framework, further strengthened by the adoption of the new criminal code and criminalization of offenses like domestic violence and forced marriages. However, there are still concerns in the implementation and effective access to justice for victims of violence against women. My question is, in your view, what are the main challenges that women and girl victims of violence face in accessing justice? And I would like the Judge Emra to start.
Good afternoon to all. And initially, I wanted to inform you that I am not able to listen to the interpretation in Albanian. Until now, I did not need it. And if possible, to ensure interpretation also in Albanian. I'd like to greet you all. As Joanna said, I am Shpresa Emra. I'm a judge working for 10 years in the basic court in Prizren. In the first 5 years, I worked in the civil department, and now I'm in the criminal department of this court. During this whole time of my work, I was committed to work in all issues related to the protection of victims' rights and victims of domestic violence. Why do I say so? This is because in our legislation from 2008, 2009, based on certain regulations on domestic violence, which moved on to another stage, which is used to work in 2 directions. cases of domestic violence are dealt both in civil and criminal procedure. And this was a major challenge for us judges who are working and used to work in the civil department, because the issue of domestic violence was not fully treated. And the trial of these cases in the civil procedure was somewhat challenging. In the beginning, we understood that a great contribution was needed to deal with these cases in civil procedure and then later in criminal procedure. Initially, we worked hard into applying those restrictive orders or protection orders, injunctions, and the situation has moved to a stage which is no longer a complicated matter, but it is a with domestic violence. Therefore, I consider that if we are dealing with a case of domestic violence in our community throughout Kosovo, the issue of domestic violence until recently and even now is considered to be a private issue. We as legislation judges and legal officials are trying to deal with these cases by adopting legislation, proper implementation of legislation, and also now with the inclusion of Istanbul Convention, domestic violence is no longer considered as a private matter or issue. It has existed for so long in our society, but was dealt by legislation at different periods of time. When I'm talking about previous criminal codes, where we had light bodily injury, the third paragraph, which would include sensitive person, and within that, also the treatment of such cases was done. There, it was never mentioned that this was domestic violence. So we had the sensitive victim and the cases were processed on that basis. With the adoption of new code, now the domestic violence is codified as a crime, and there are certain steps as to what we are entitled to do and what the criminal offense entails in itself and which are the features of the offense. In the basic court in prison, I'm designated judge for the last 3-4 years, and also being a coordinator as the only judge dealing with domestic violence cases. Also in the prosecutor's office, we have a prosecutor who deals with these domestic violence cases. This is because during our work, we noted that if a judge is assigned who would deal with all cases of domestic violence, there would be greater efficiency and also greater professionalism, because this judge would deal with these cases in the same way, and then the sentencing will be done more quickly and more professionally. In this regard, we had success, and in coordination with prosecutors, for every case that comes to this court, the case is referred to me as a designated judge for domestic violence cases without being part of the case allocation system, which means that no time is lost in the process, in the procedure. The case is brought to me and it is heard. So this practice is because previously we had cases when cases came to the court and could not be properly prioritized. And if it was not given priority, then the case would be put into the case allocation system. and the judges would get same number of cases to look into, and we could not know which are the cases with priority in order to treat them quickly and swiftly, and often the cases would be forgotten in the shelves, and the situation on the ground may have escalated. In terms of the victims' rights, these are cases of urgent nature and need to be treated quickly. So the way how we work now is much better one, much more effective in resolving these cases, because it is indeed a challenge, because the longer the victim waits and has no access to judiciary, it may lose trust on the system and may feel itself lost and hopeless. Otherwise, if we act swiftly and impose the sentence to the perpetrator in a quick fashion, then this is proper way of delivering justice, because in case of any justice denied, that would amount to drastic violation on the human and victims' rights. So with regard to the access of victims, there are also victims advocates who support the victims and the police during hearings at the prosecution, during the trial. Because victims advocates should be increased in the number, as their support is necessary. The victim, as soon as such case happens and they need a lot of support, professional one, shelter, treatment, contacting with children. And in this regard, I consider that victims advocates are the ones who would be able to provide the proper professional support, and they appear and are part of our trials in courts and prosecution. We have a shelter here, and they are cooperating also in a regular way and support us regardless of the case, if and when such shelter is needed and required. Most of the cases concerning domestic violence or gender-based violence are former spouses, persons who had certain relations or connections. We also have cases where parents are involved, but in a smaller number, I would say. I do not have any particular statistical data here, but most of these cases, the victims would go back to the family and continue their life with the offender. Perhaps this would be all from my side for the beginning, and let me not take much of the time from our colleagues, and in the due course of this conversation, I will rejoin the discussion.
Thank you, Judge Emrah. It was good to hear that there has been some progress, and these cases are taken more seriously. But let's move on. I now give the floor to Prosecutor Tafa.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. As the moderator said in the beginning, I am Giara Tagliani. In the past 4 years, I work as a prosecutor in the General Department within Basic Prosecution Office in Pristina. From September this year, I've been assigned coordinator in this prosecution office where I work, in charge for domestic violence cases. As Judge Emra already pointed out, here in the prosecution office in Pristina, we had a profilization of prosecutors dealing with domestic violence cases. In March of this year, 2 prosecutors were assigned to deal exclusively with domestic violence cases, and from September, I joined this team and I was appointed coordinator in the prosecutor for these cases. Profilization of prosecutors, and also I hope that in the future there will be a profilization of judges as well in the court, basic court in Pristina. This indeed is a very good thing, and that also relates to your question on access of domestic violence victims to justice and efficiency, effectiveness of the services and so. Now, with regards to your question about victims' access to justice in Kosovo, despite that Kosovo has a really advanced legislation, and recently with the incorporation of the Istanbul Convention as part of legislation, I think there is still issues that we need to overcome when it comes to providing proper support to domestic violence victims. In most of the cases, domestic violence cases, and as various statistics provided by different organizations show, that main victims of domestic violence are women and children, and mostly the perpetrators are male partners or current or former spouses. Economic dependency, in addition to not reporting these cases, forces domestic violence victims that during and in the procedure they change their statements or declarations. In practice, in most of the cases, women state that their husband or spouse had been exercising such violence onto them and against their children for years, although this was the first time they reported them to the police and they had been violent and abusive for years. In most of the cases, this, and when a case was or has been reported for the first time, it was not reported directly by the victim, but usually by the family members, other family members, or the neighbors. And main factors, underlying factors, are unemployment, financial dependency, and so. On the other hand, it's good that we have shelters, but shelters are not the best possible solution for the victims. These shelters often are not utilized by women because they hesitate due to their children going to school and needing to interrupt schooling. With the victims' advocates, we have good cooperation, and they always provide an opportunity to these victims to have access not only to report the cases, but also protection or restrictive orders. And we have a very good cooperation with victims' advocates. However, the problem lies also often on the fact that they don't have sufficient staff. They don't have support staff either, and I hope that in the future these institutions are strengthened so that they provide a better access to victims in justice, so better access to justice. So this was my share regarding this question, and I hope we will continue discussing it.
Thank you very much, Prosecutor Tafa. Very interesting points about why, for instance, women don't want to go to the shelters. We can come back to that later on. I will now give the floor to Ms. Tagliani.
Thank you, Joanna, and thanks a lot for making me a part of this panel with such inspirational panelists. So thanks a lot. Let me just say that, of course, the observation I will mention, they mainly come from the work that our mission does as part of its monitoring activities. And I would also like to underline that what we monitor and what we observe in Kosovo is not just peculiar to Kosovo, but there are problematics and success stories that are typical also of many countries. I think, for example, about my own country back home in Italy. When it comes to challenges, let me first start from something that Press already mentioned, the patriarchal society and the fact of reporting as being a taboo. If we want victims to effectively access justice, victims need to know what mechanisms are available to them. So, of course, Kosovo has come a long way and has made a lot of progresses in raising awareness about what mechanisms are available to victims, and we need to continue on this path because, of course, we are on the good track, but as it has been mentioned, there is still a lot of work to do. We still work and live within a patriarchal society, and we really have to invest a lot of energy on creating trust and on letting victims know how they can come forward and what mechanisms are available to them. Also, as already been mentioned, the importance of the different institutional and service provider mechanisms to coordinate among them. And this is fundamental, like the whole access to justice chain need to work perfectly together. You know, every piece of the chain needs to work together and coordinate in order to offer a proper service to victims. And for example, something that I've been also noticing and observing, and we have been noticing as a mission, it's just an example of how the risk assessment tool has been used. So, for example, the tool of risk assessment is really well used by police, but it's something that somehow stays there. Whereas, you know, it's something that should also involve the whole chain of institutional response. And in order to do this, the whole chain, as I mentioned, has to work. So it cannot be just something done by police at the early stage of a criminal offense, and then police doesn't have any clue of what continues to be done in the case, right? So this is really what we all have to aim to and to achieve, that the whole chain keeps on working together until the end of the case. Judge Spress already mentioned the importance, and also Prosecutor Taff already mentioned the importance of specialization and the importance of accessing quality and specialized services. And this is also very important. We often mention that there is need to have a gender-responsive budgeting mechanism within the access to justice services, because only in this way we can ensure quality services for victims. And this, it comprises a whole range of things, ranging from importance of training and specialization, which is what has been advanced a lot in Kosovo, as it was mentioned, especially in this year with the figures of specialized prosecutors and judges. But also there is an urgent need of allocating sufficient resources to the whole responsive chain. And with this, I mean a lot of things, the necessity of having proper interviewing rooms at police station, the availability of constant training, updating legal professional training. So it's a whole set of measures. We really need to start thinking in a way that allows an empowering way of accessing justice for victims and offering really quality services. Sentencing has been already mentioned also by Judge Spress, and is something that is really dear to our core activity of monitoring within ULEX. We reported on this also in our last published report, the importance of sentencing. the primary goal of sentencing should be to protect victims, right? Of course, there is also a component that it has to do with rehabilitation of perpetrators, but we have to think about how fundamental is sentencing in order to protect and to entrust victims. And that's why there is need to do a lot of work on how sentencing in domestic violence and other form of gender-based violence cases is carried out. Let me also mention a few more points. Need for effective compensation for victims. You know, victims need to know also that they can effectively access compensation as an important part of the access to justice mechanism. I was happy to hear when we had a talk a few days ago with Basil Castrati, the head of the victim advocacy offices, that there will be soon in place a new set of regulation that will allow victims of domestic violence to access compensation in an easier way, bypassing all the legal difficulties that are in place now. So that would already be fostering an effective access to compensation for victims. Also, something that we notice now, especially during this pandemic time, it was really difficult to access reliable data. And I know maybe the concept of data when it comes to access to justice might seem a bit far, but in fact, we need to be able to access reliable data in order to get the proper scope of the justice situation and to properly address actions, right? And of course, on the domestic violence aspect, we are on the right track with the database, and the database has been functioning, and the idea is that soon all institutions will properly insert data, but this still is leaving out all other forms of gender-based violence. I'm thinking about sexual violence cases. We are very we lack proper collection of data in a structural way when it comes to sexual violence cases. So also this, and my last point that I see also as an ongoing challenge, again, I repeat, not just for Kosovo, but for many other countries, it's what the Istanbul Convention focuses a lot, meaning the importance of ex officio investigating and prosecution for cases of gender-based violence. As ULEX, we monitor sometimes the fact that the investigation in cases were terminated because, let's say, the statement of victims were not enough. And I think it is quite clear now also from the standards of the Istanbul Convention that there is a call, a paramount call to undertake all possible other steps also before concluding investigation and terminating investigation. So this is also another point I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Giara. There was really many good points you made there, more about the structural problems that we have in the fight against violence against women. Let's move on to now to the second question, and I changed the order. So the first question goes to Prosecutor Tafa, and it's that victim-centered and gender-sensitive approach is fundamental for an effective access to justice. At the same time, in order to have long-term solutions, working with perpetrators is equally fundamental. What are your thoughts on this, and where does Kosovo stand on this? And the question actually is that, to what extent national legislation and legal practices mirror the paramount necessity of using a victim-centered approach, as well as also working with perpetrators on their rehabilitation?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. The work with victims, with the perpetrators, and their rehabilitation is a rather long-term solution, and often also a better solution for the victim itself and for its family. As we said it as I said it in the beginning, we have a legislation where we provide this possibility based on the criminal code of Republic of Kosovo. Based on the criminal code of Kosovo, there is a possibility the court may impose a conditional sentence against the perpetrator associated with an order for mandatory rehabilitation treatment.
është i varur nga droga dhe alkooli. Mund të them se tek rastet
I can say that in cases of domestic violence, we have a number of other situations where the perpetrators commit such violence in the family, being addicted from either alcohol or drugs, and the court, based on the legislation and secondary legislation, we can pursue such avenues. However, to what extent this is implemented in practice, that leaves a lot of room to hope for, because we don't have sufficient and proper institutions to deal with the perpetrators, both with the perpetrator and the victim, so that the perpetrator is rehabilitated. As often, the reason for reporting of a domestic violence case is often because the victim states the reasons why it has reported the case was not because she really decided to separate or have the partner incarcerated, but simply to prevent repetition of these cases in the future. So I think that we need to continue reinforcing these institutions to deal also with the reintegration part of the perpetrators involved in domestic violence cases. In practice, when perpetrators are with diminished mental ability, there is a possibility to take them to psychiatric institutions based on the proposal or referral of the prosecutor in charge or the court decision. And as soon as we have a forensic institute report that such a thing has to be done, this doesn't happen in practice as a rule. With regards to the other question that was utilizing this victim-centered approach regarding all relevant policies, here again there is a lot of room to work, and indeed it is one of the requirements of the Istanbul Convention that has become applicable in the case of Kosovo. The approach towards victims by relevant institutions when the victim reports a domestic violence case, I think it is still not at the desired level, and this may be the case in the near future, as nowadays in the police and in the prosecution offices, certain courts, the professionalization of professionals dealing with these cases has already started. So these people will be trained. Some already have been trained on how to approach domestic violence victims. Strengthening or further enhancing the skills of these professionals would also be fully in line with the law and Istanbul Convention. And that would be a great deal of support for the gender violence victims. So the way how they are approached, and in my working experience, I noticed that it is very important on how we approach the victims, and it should be as friendly as possible. victims of domestic violence cases are not always, or they are not, or they should not be treated the same way as other victims of other criminal cases. So they are much more sensitive, and there should be due care and attention paid to these victims. So these are my thoughts about these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosecutor Tafa. And I now give the floor to Judge Emra.
Thank you.
Now, with regards to this question, the prosecutor already told about most of the practicalities that are involved in our daily work. I consider that these requirements would be implemented in full if such services would be delivered by professionals who recognize the type and the nature of domestic violence cases and victims thereof. That starts from the first statement given by the victim at the police station, and that is highly important because re-victimization by asking the victim to provide second and third testimony or statement does not contribute in the best way to solving the case. In the police, there are separate offices or specific investigators or police officers who are involved in dealing with domestic violence cases. They have the SOPs based on which they carry out their work. So they use those SOPs to interview the victims, they invite victims' advocates, and if necessary, to take victims to shelters. In cooperation with the prosecutors, they conduct or carry out this interviewing procedure the first time when they discuss with the victims. If there is a need for medical attention, they also provide such medical attention. Based on certain procedures and the law, the victim has the main role, or this leading role, that we should provide protection for those victims in order for them to feel safe to continue the procedure, because any uncertainty on the part of the victims would have a damaging effect. They would be re-victimized, and up until they come to the court, a certain period of time would lapse, and they may alter their statement, they may withdraw from the process, and justice would not be served in the way that they did not have proper access. The victim is entitled to compensation, so we have the law on compensation, and it provides compensation for all of the experiences in terms of material, psychological damage that can be pursued in another procedure. This law on compensation should be amended so that the victims are provided compensation or support immediately. There should be an available fund that would ensure an immediate support, because in most of the cases, victims come from a very poor economic situation or reality. Most of them have no support from their close relatives. They don't even have support from their families and are in need for financial, material support. Now, with regards to rehabilitation of perpetrators, that would be, I guess, the best solution, because the perpetrator is the one causing trouble. The perpetrator is the one to be punished. By simply punishing the perpetrator, we do not solve the whole problem, because often we have repeated offenders or recidivists. So the case or the issue is often the same and is repeated, and the court acts more severely when we have such repeated offenders. But again, this is not a solution to the problem. Based on the law, based on the criminal code, we may also impose additional sanctions for rehabilitation. Often we have persons addicted to alcohol or drugs, and we need to prescribe them a proper therapy. We cannot clearly establish whether a person is an addict, but we are not professionals to determine what addiction means and is. So in certain cases, when the criminal offense is committed under the influence of either drugs or alcohol, that may be a cause, but addiction have to be established by professionals, and that's why we need experts who would be working swiftly, and also specific institutions that would treat them if these are to be proven causes of such cases. As the prosecutor said, unfortunately, in this regard, we don't have proper institutions in place where we could take such individuals who suffer from addiction. We only have this health institution in prison, psychiatric forensic institute in Pristina. But this institution mainly treats those individuals with mental issues. During the pandemic, criminal offenses were committed and persons needed assistance or support by psychiatrists, and victims were suffering only because the perpetrator had psychological issues or problems. We have this forensic institute where these people are taken to, and there are professional doctors who determine what measure has to be applied, whether the perpetrators are to be sent to an open facility, semi-open one, or left in liberty. So in these cases, a certain period for treatment is set, therapy is associated to that, and some 5 or 6 recent cases I've been dealing with, treatment was successful. If these individuals were subject to treatment when they came for the second time here, they came completely as different individuals or persons, and the treatment proved very successful. This is why we as a society, and also NGOs and others working in judiciary, both judges, prosecutors, police, centers for social work, victims advocates, should all be involved to try and rehabilitate as much as we can the perpetrators. And then we would be making much, much greater success and less number of victims, because the problem would be treated on time or timely. So I hope I answered the question.
Oh yes, yes, yeah. Thank you, Judge Emra. And it's, I mean, it's very clear that now that all of you have pointed out that the problem of violence against women is not just one problem, but it is a symptom of many other problems, many other societal and economic problems. Let's move on. Next to Giara.
Yeah, I mean, basically the previous speakers already mentioned it all. So of course, safety of victim is our priority, but since violence is often part of a cycle, we need to break this cycle, and we cannot do this if we do not properly address rehabilitation of perpetrators. And also because by doing this, we can effectively stop violence and further enhance safety of victims. But also because, as it was mentioned, working with perpetrators is part of a wider process of cultural change, you know, towards diminishing gendered violence. So of course it's important to insert this topic within the broader aspect of societal change. But like Judge Emra mentioned, I mean, in order to do this, there need to be we go back to the importance of having enough resources allocated. Like we need to have a proper structure that has enough resources in order for all the pieces to effectively work. Because exactly like if a judge imposes certain measures, but the measures cannot effectively be carried out, then we are again at the starting point. So again, like what we mentioned earlier, the importance of proper allocations of resources. On the victim-based approach, Prosecutor Taff already mentioned, it's of course the specialization of the careers helps a lot, because also the victim-based approach is something that needs to be fostered more also by way of training, or specialized training, and it's something that we really need to work on and master in our daily work. And it's really like also these require like a broader swift towards a gender sensitive approach to victims. And I'm just thinking also some examples are not only technical aspect like interviewing in specific interviewing rooms, but also it has to do with careful consideration to the method of introducing evidence. Judge Emra also mentioned the number of times the victims are interviewed. They should be reduced to the minimum. So all measures that aim at minimizing re-traumatization of victims. Also what I find very interesting, and it's also really enlightened in the spirit of the Istanbul Convention. It's also about the need of not approaching victims based on assumption, right? So violent incidents affect each victim in a different way. And often there is a tendency to assume a certain way in which a victim should behave. And if the victim doesn't behave in a certain way, then it means that, okay, there was not, the incident was not that severe. And what we need to aim to is also to really approach victim without assumption, and also assuming that we cannot assess credibility of a victim based on the victim emotional behavior. So of course, as we can see, these are all sets, specific sets that also will require extensive training and specific expertise. And that's why, of course, the fact of having specialized figures, it's already helping a lot in this. And for the rest, it was already mentioned before, so I will not repeat anything. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Giara. And we have now reached the third and the final question. I will read it soon. And I would like the order to answer is first Judge Emra, then Prosecutor Tafa, and then Giara. I'm kind of asking you to a little bit look into the future. The Istanbul Convention calls for comprehensive and coordinated policies encompassing a multitude of measures to be taken by different actors, which taken as a whole offer a holistic response to violence against women. And now comes the looking into the future. How do you think the recent inclusion of the Istanbul Convention in the Kosovo Constitution will advance access to justice for victims of violence against women? Judge Emra, please.
I consider that Istanbul Convention is one of the conventions that has truly analyzed violence against women and discrimination, because violence until now did not have this same approach. They would only provide a definition of gender, and until now this was not based in conventions or other laws. Now, regarding our legislation and the code, before incorporating the Istanbul Convention into the Constitution, we had already approved and had law on domestic violence in the criminal code and the enforced marriages. These are two novelties that we already applied before adopting or starting using and implementing the Istanbul Convention, being part of the Kosovo's constitution. But the fact that it is now enshrined or rooted in our constitution gives us hope that official institutions and the state bodies and our entire society will start understand and change this patriarchal attitude that we have. None of the laws cannot change our stances and views overnight. Time is needed, and I was very happy when this convention was ratified in the assembly by all MPs without any resistance. So regardless of whether victims are women, or actually regardless of the MPs being men or women, all of them voted unanimously to adopt the Istanbul Convention. This will further strengthen and oblige the state authorities and will make them even more responsible to develop mechanisms that should be working in this direction. This should not be a single track approach or effort. There should be a multi-pronged approach, inclusion of all mechanisms to come to a desired level of the implementation of provisions of the convention. Domestic violence had caused some difficulties in our practice because there were no such provisions in the previous legislation, but future amendments should further elaborate and expand on this concept and notion, and the convention itself and its inclusion will be a further empowerment of all stakeholders or involved parties, including us professionals, so that this matter is brought to the attention and the wider public is made aware of the need to work together to deal with this type of cases in a rather holistic way. I am hopeful, and I believe both judges and prosecutors would be working to make things better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Emra. And then Prosecutor Tafa. The floor is yours. You are unmute. You are muted. Yeah, there.
Po, faleminderit.
Thank you.
Të mos e përsëris atë çfarë vetëm tha
Now, in order not to repeat what honored Judge Emra said, I would add maybe a few things. The Istanbul Convention is based on the premises that not only a single institution or agency has to deal with domestic violence victims or violence against women, but an efficient response to such types of violence requires involvement of more than one actor. The convention is supported by all countries that have incorporated it into their national legislation to implement comprehensive and coordinated policies to include state institutions, NGOs, and also local and regional authorities. Kosovo's government prepares the national strategy of Republic of Kosovo for protection against domestic violence. In this strategy, there is a number of activities required to be completed, as also stipulated in the Istanbul Convention, but now we need to further strengthen the current or the institutions we have, and also the activities should not mean that we only draft a good national strategy, but rather we need to work more to implement those activities or requirements that we are going to put in the strategy, including those that we discussed earlier, so that treatment of perpetrators of domestic violence through mandatory treatment programs, awareness of the population, changing of mentality, of this prejudice towards the victims, also changing of attitudes in the institution. So all in all, there is still a lot of work to do. Then comes compensation for victims of such violence, and this would be the direction we should all be headed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosecutor Tafa. And then over to Giara.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. As it has been mentioned, I mean, Kosovo was already on the very good track, right? So even before the inclusion of the Istanbul Convention, we already had the criminalization of domestic violence in the criminal code. I can think of already the figure of national coordinator on domestic violence, which was not the case in many other countries. Of course, the inclusion of the convention has been and is a landmark moment, being the most far-reaching legal instrument to prevent and combat violence against women, and also because of the spirit of the convention, right, which brings that it was, as it has been mentioned, this comprehensive and holistic approach as being the only way towards effective prevention and combating of violence against women. Now we will have to see how Kosovo institution, of course, will be expected to fully commit to all the standards of the convention. So we will have to see how this will go. What I can say is what has been noticed already from other countries since I've been reporting to the Grevio Committee, which is the committee reporting on implementation of the convention, and many other countries have reported significant improvements, right? For example, many countries reported an increase of shelters or better financial sustainability of shelters, better functioning helpline. Many countries also reported on the fact that since the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, the topic of prevention and combating of violence against women has been more and more on the agenda, which is also what we mentioned earlier, right? That we need to keep on raising awareness and have the topic on the agenda and talk about it and address it. So the hope is that all the positive development that we see from countries that are already reporting on the Istanbul Convention will also be reflected in Kosovo. So I think what we can take from this is really like a positive attitude towards what is coming. A lot of work, like Prosecutor Tafa says, definitely there is a lot of work expecting all of us, local institution, and also us as supporting international organization. But I think it can only bring good things. So this will be my message. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Giara. And I now open the floor for questions and comments if any of the participants have any.
You may use the chat, or you can also take the floor.
Yeah, there's Adelina Berisha, please.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. It was very nice to hear all this great discussion, and it's never enough to talk about access to justice for victims of different forms of violence against women. And especially now that for us, it's a new start with Istanbul Convention, and there are lots of efforts that are awaiting us in the future. But I think because we are in 16 days of activism, I would like to bring here a bit of activism. And it's amazing that we have here two women who are judges and prosecutors. And in this case, we need solidarity and sisterhood if we want really to support victims. And by this, I mean that sometimes I feel that we forget about this, that we should cooperate with each other. We should stand together to support these victims. Prosecutors, when they face difficulties in finding evidence, they should address to civil society organizations, who service providers who work directly with victims, and they can give a straightforward answer which is backed up by evidence, by research on different consequences that violence have on victims. We saw last week the story in RTK about a minor child in Mitrovica who was a case of incest. And we saw that because the prosecution couldn't bring enough evidence in front of courts, the perpetrator is free and they are now living together in the same house. So when we recall all these cases, we see that we should work together. We should talk about our colleagues who are not doing their job properly. If we know that we have, like, or for example, the excuse the judge is giving Suzana Sekiracha's case, your imagination goes beyond Alfred Hitchcock's imagination. That is not an official reply by a judge. If I would be a judge in this case, I would go and find who my colleague was, and I would report him to the council of judges, or to whoever the higher body is, to report judges who are not performing their duties as they should. So I want to raise to use this opportunity that we are in 16 days of activism, and remind ourselves that beyond professionals, we are a bit also activists. We have fought for our rights since the 90s for different topics. Now we are fighting for something else, but we should always keep in mind that just by sticking together and just by sharing the information, we will help victims. And then the other one is that if we fail to implement Istanbul Convention, Grevio will report for us. Council of Europe will make Grevio through their studies to report that Kosovo is not implementing Istanbul Convention as we should. And that would be a big minus for us in our process of EU accession. Our aim is to go there, to be part of EU. So in all aspects, we have to be very committed, and we have to cooperate, and we have to raise our voice and to be the voice of those who are less fortunate. I mean, we are in a privileged position, and we should use this privilege to support victims. And just today, we have a case of an international girl who has been married last 2 months with an Albanian man here in Kosovo, and she has suffered different forms of violence from him. She had lots of complaints about how she was treated within the police, and she feels scared. And for us, it's a big challenge as civil society to initiate things without having state support and without having state as partners in supporting this case and all the cases that address to us. So let's remind this that we are on this together. We are not here to put blame on each other, but we are here to support victims. And victims are supported just us being objective and just by us sticking to our duties and responsibilities and supporting them. I'm sorry I took your time, and I wish you all, I cannot say happy 16 days, but we are kind of, they have this aim to raise awareness, and let's hope that we will manage to do some changes in the society, but also in ourselves and in our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adelina, for your very powerful intervention. Does any of the panel members want to comment? Okay, if not, any more questions or comments? No, I don't see anything. Is there, Alina, anything in the chat?
No, I don't see.
Okay.
Maybe Ioana I will also want to thank Adelina, because this is also the message that we got from the previous talk with Tiana, who is also present today, Vesna from the shelter, and Basri from the Victim Advocacy Office. Really, like, the importance of all working together, right? Our aim is victims assisting victims, and and empowering each other. And we can only do this by working all together. So thank you, Adelina, also for reiterating this message also today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Giara. If there are not any more comments or questions, I tried to just in the end here just do some key messages. There were very many of them. I mean, there is lots of challenges when you work in this field in violence against women and domestic violence. And one of the biggest challenges is that, you know, often it is considered a private matter. It's a family matter, and it is not to be discussed, even if there is a very good legislation in place. So it requires also this attitude change. But also, as it was mentioned many times here, it's violence against women is not just a symptom of a patriarchal society, but it is a symptom of many kinds of problems, whether they are economic problems, you have substance abuse problems. So there really needs to be institutions and actors who can look at this problem as a whole and not just a separate isolated problem. That was also very interesting for me to hear that women don't want to go to necessarily don't want to go to shelters because of the economic dependence and because of children. And of course, it shouldn't be like that, but there should be, again, structures and policies and safety nets so that women are able to go there. And that we have these structural, so we have these kind of attitudinal societal problems, but then we have the structures that we don't necessarily have the institutions, or we have them, but they need to be strengthened, and the capacities of those people working in these institutions need to be strengthened. That means resources. It means gender budgeting. There needs to be in the budget money for these institutions. Yeah, and then very important point is the rehabilitation of the perpetrator is the key. And I have been working in this field in gender issues for many years, and it has always kind of bothered me that it's very woman-centered. Of course it is, because when we talk about violence against women, it is about the female victims. But then we also have to engage men in this battle and perpetrators. It doesn't help that, you know, if there is compensation, if there are shelters, if the perpetrators are put in jail, but if they are not rehabilitated, then the problem goes on and on. But it was like Giara said, that the positive thing here is that there already was in Kosovo. Kosovo was on a very good track even before the Istanbul Convention, and there is positive attitude among those who have the power to change things. But the battle needs to continue. I thank everybody for your participation. A big thanks to the speakers and also to the interpreters. I see that there was Arben and Emina doing the interpretation. And thank you for Alina taking care of the technical side of this. I think there is going to be two talks next week. At least there are scheduled 2 talks next week, and I hope to see people there also. And if anybody doesn't have anything to say, I wish you all good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, bye.